Hi, I'm Donald Macintyre. I grew up in Vancouver and parts of British Columbia and went to university here. Then I decided to go into journalism, and I ended up spending quite a bit of time in Korea and other parts of Asia. I originally worked as a correspondent in Japan for Time magazine, and in those days we used to cover Korea from Japan, so we'd fly over to Korea from Japan. Korea was always more interesting. In Japan, it was not much of a story, and all the journalists there they were always looking for an excuse to go and visit Korea. So one day I suggested to my boss, why don't we set up a bureau in Seoul? And so I ended up setting up the first permanent bureau for Time magazine in Seoul, covering South Korea and North Korea. So I spent a few years from Japan covering Korea, and then moved there in 2001 and was the bureau chief until 2006. Before I went to Korea, I really didn't have an image of what Korea was like. Probably not the only one. I think at that time, Japan was taking over the world, and it was all Japan, Japan, Japan. This was before China started to take over the world. It was also right after the financial crisis in '98. I was surprised to see just how dynamic and hardworking everybody was. It was very different from Japan. Obviously some similarities, but I think the culture and the people I felt were very different. A lot of people were trying to get back up on their feet after the financial crisis, and I interviewed some families that were going into new businesses, doing whatever they had to do to get through this hard time. And that was interesting. There was this kind of spirit of really just working hard to get through a difficult time that I noticed. It was also a time of optimism about relations with North Korea. Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il met in that famous peace summit, and there was hope that that would lead to some resolution of the situation there. If I look back, it was very different from the Korea you would see today. Not nearly as developed as it was today. For example, it was hard I like coffee and food, so I'll give you some examples. It was hard to find a cup of coffee. It was all the kind of very old-fashioned coffee shops in dingy basement rooms with people smoking and so on. Well, first Starbucks arrived, and then Koreans have started opening coffee shops everywhere. Now there's just some of the best coffee in the world. When I started first going over from Tokyo, the plane would arrive at 8 or 9 in the evening. The problem was, where do I eat? Everything was shut by 9 o'clock. And in fact, outside of the big hotels, there weren't that many Western restaurants. A lot of very small, very Korean style restaurants, but Gangnam was very different. That, of course, has changed. Korea has become so much more international, along with excellent Korean food, of course, but you also have this whole cultural scene that's developed, K-pop and tourism and music, whatever, you name it, it's there today. One thing that's very striking is how Korea's international profile has changed. When I started first learning about Korea, you would always hear that Korea had kind of slipped between the cracks a little bit between China and Japan. And Korea was a little overlooked. And when I was growing up in Vancouver, there was very little, you didn't hear about Korea. Today, I think there's a much greater awareness of Korea for a number of reasons. What's interesting is there's a wide range of areas where Korea has suddenly become higher profile. There's obviously movies and Parasite winning an Oscar, there's K-pop, there's TV dramas, which I can tell you get watched a lot in my house. And when I was still living in Asia and traveling around Asia, I started to hear about more and more people watching Korean TV dramas. Now it's in North America. And coming back to Canada, I'm just struck by some of these, how the awareness of Korea has grown. That was culture, but there's obviously now Korean cars. Hyundai is a respected brand. You have Samsung. In fact, in electronics, you're more likely to have a Korean brand than a Japanese brand. It used to be all the Sonys and so on. Was up at Whistler Mountain, the ski resort recently. We went to a little cafe, and on the menu they had sandwiches, and one of the sandwiches was called the kimchi K-pop. That would not have happened 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. The fact that Korea is well known enough that you can talk about kimchi, you can talk about K-pop, and that you can name a sandwich after kimchi K-pop. I find that quite extraordinary. So that is really a sea change. I think I can see it because I was out of the country for a long time. I was in Korea seeing some of the changes. When I come back, I see that people have noticed. The world has noticed. I listen to the radio in Vancouver, CBC, and I hear interviews about Korean TV or people talking about blogging about Korean restaurants. That international recognition has come, and relatively young immigrant community here, but it's growing, and I think that's an advantage for them. I think if you come to Vancouver and a student or a business person, you say, I'm from South Korea, people get, oh, that's cool, or, I love K-pop, or I watch Korean movies. That is new and very positive for Korea. I come back, see the restaurants, I see more Korean signs, Korean churches, but compared to some of the other communities, I'm not seeing a lot of Korean culture. The South Indian community and the Chinese community are the biggest communities here, I believe. Korea's catching up, but it's still smaller. But those communities have cultural events involving food and music and so on. They bring out not just the local community, but Canadians from outside that community come and enjoy the food and learn about the community. I don't see that in Vancouver. It's time to start thinking about that. There's discussion apparently of creating a Koreatown in that part of Vancouver near Robson, where there's some Korean restaurants and businesses, and there's obviously bigger communities in Coquitlam and Burnaby. I think if those communities, Chuseok, you'd get a lot of people out there, and the advantage that Korea has is it's not just food and kind of traditional culture, which will interest some people, but you can have things that will bring in young people, like K-pop and movies and gaming and all those kinds of things. And would be good to see, and maybe it's just a question of the community's reached a certain level, and that's the next step. Well, let me start just with as a foreigner in Korea, as a correspondent, what I notice spirit Koreans have. A lot of foreigners who live there are just attracted or maybe very surprised when they start to see the story of Korea. There's the expression or the phrase, the miracle on the hand. Korea recovering from the Korean War and from nothing becoming an industrialized country. And since then, it's just continued to develop. When I was there, I worked on a story on the Korean TV dramas. They were getting better, but I have to say I wasn't expecting them to reach the level they have. That's something that's very hard to do. If you look at TV dramas from other Asian countries, including Japan, they tend to be too local. There's a level of professionality and production values that's missing. So the fact that Korea has been able to produce dramas that are kind of universal in appeal is kind of a miracle for me, looking at that. Koreans sometimes do things that nobody expects them to do, or they're told, well, no, that's not possible. But then you turn around and it's happened. Every time I go back to Korea, it's changed, and there's something that I wasn't expecting has suddenly become every day. For the community here, that can be an inspiration. I'm not an expert on the situation of Koreans here, but I think that one of the key challenges is obviously language. I think particularly if you're running a business, there's challenges. But I also feel that maybe those challenges are not as big as people think. I train business people here to write in better English, and they're native speakers. But what they write is not clear. They want to use a lot of big fancy words and business jargon and buzzwords. That's not really good communication. So the fact that you're not a native speaker really isn't the big challenge. If you look at how to write in very clear, plain English, I think in any culture the language is important, but Koreans are a little bit like Canadians in some way. They're a little bit shy, I think, about their abilities. They don't want to toot their own horn. But actually the level of English among Koreans I found is pretty high, higher than Japan. Wouldn't take much coming here to get your business English up to a level that's going to be perfectly acceptable. It doesn't matter if you're making a few grammatical mistakes. Nobody cares. If you can say something in clear, simple words that people can understand, they'll be happy and they'll appreciate that. We heard that Camoa TV is putting together a summer camp for young Koreans here. So that's a very exciting idea, and Orbis Leadership hopes to be a part of it. The kind of courses that we do that are directed at young people, anything from basic business writing to putting together a presentation, but also one of our focuses is leadership communication, meaning communication as a leadership skill. Leaders spend 80% of their time communicating. As a leader, you need to be able to speak, you need to be able to write, you need to understand the kind of words and language that leaders use to connect with that audience. And that's a really important skill for young people who are going to start a business, go to university, go into a company. In Canada and the United States, a lot of companies are starting to look more at soft skills. They're having trouble. They can find people with technical skills and so on, but they're having trouble finding good employees who can communicate effectively to rise up that leadership ladder in a company. That's one of the things you need. And so a great thing for young people to start learning about and thinking about and practicing, and a great activity for a summer camp.